nurse mocks black woman's labor pain, unaware her husband controls the entire hospital. The harsh winter wind howled outside Memorial Hospital's windows as Jackie gripped the delivery room's armrest, her knuckles white with tension. Through the haze of excruciating pain, she caught the dismissive glance from Nurse Nancy, a look she'd grown painfully familiar with over the past 6 hours. First-time mothers always exaggerate. Nancy's words echoed in her mind as another contraction tore through her body. Jackie, a pediatric nurse herself, knew something was terribly wrong. But in this moment, her decade of medical experience meant nothing. She was just another black woman whose pain didn't matter. Before we start, share where you're watching from. If you're new or haven't subscribed, please click subscribe. It means the world to us. Thanks. Jackie Thompson wasn't just another expectant mother in Memorial Hospital's maternity ward. At 34, she'd spent the last decade in the hospital's pediatric intensive care unit, saving countless young lives with steady hands and unwavering dedication. Her colleagues knew her as the nurse who could calm the most distressed child, who worked double shifts during emergencies, and who never lost her composure until today. David Thompson, the hospital's chief operating officer, paced the delivery room in his wrinkled Brooks Brothers suit, his usually commanding presence diminished by worry. 6 years ago, he'd implemented diversity initiatives throughout the hospital network, but now, watching his wife struggle to be heard, those achievements felt hollow. Their journey to this moment had been long: 3 miscarriages, 2 failed IVF attempts, and countless nights holding each other through the pain of loss. Nurse Nancy Weber stood by the monitors, her 20 years of experience wrapped around her like armor. Few knew of the tragedy that shaped her: the loss of her own son during childbirth 15 years ago. That night in another hospital, another city, she'd screamed that something was wrong, but no one listened. The experience had hardened her, turned her empathy to stone. She'd developed her own theories about pain tolerance among different races, theories that had no place in modern medicine but governed her every decision. Dr. James Sullivan, chief of obstetrics, carried his own silent burden. As one of the few black chief surgeons in the state, he'd climbed the ranks despite systematic barriers, carefully choosing his battles. His office walls displayed degrees from Harvard Medical School and Johns Hopkins, yet he still caught the occasional doubtful glances from patients and staff. He understood Jackie's struggle on a level few others could, having faced similar dismissal of his concerns early in his career. The supporting cast of hospital staff moved through their shifts like a Greek chorus: young nurses who watched Nancy's behavior with growing concern, administrative staff who'd noticed patterns but feared speaking up, and veteran doctors who maintained the status quo. Among them was Sarah Chin, a first-year resident who'd been documenting Nancy's pattern of behavior in her personal journal, waiting for the right moment to speak up. Through the hospital's fluorescent-lit corridors, these lives intersected like constellations, each carrying their own stories of triumph and tragedy. Jackie's labor would prove to be the gravitational force that pulled them all into alignment, forcing confrontations with their own biases, fears, and responsibilities. The night shift staff whispered about the irony how the hospital's own Kua's wife was experiencing the very discrimination he'd tried to eliminate. Some wondered if David's position would make a difference. Others knew that in moments of medical crisis, titles meant little against ingrained prejudice. Another difficult patient Nancy had marked in Jackie's chart, a subtle note that carried weighted implications. The same hands that had saved Nancy's son years ago now gripped the hospital bed in pain, though neither woman recognized the connection yet. This cold winter night would strip away their professional veneers, forcing each to confront the human cost of prejudice and the price of silence. The stage was set in the sterile confines of Memorial Hospital's maternity ward, where life's most precious moments collided with healthcare's darkest realities. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in white, while inside, a story of prejudice, power, and redemption was about to unfold. Memorial Hospital stood like a sentinel against the brutal January night, its windows glowing against the darkened Boston skyline. The worst winter storm in a decade battered the city, with 3 feet of snow already on the ground and more falling in thick, relentless sheets. Inside, the maternity ward on the 4th floor operated like its own universe, isolated from the chaos of the emergency room below, where accident victims from the treacherous roads arrived in steady streams. The journey to this night had been treacherous in more ways than one. Jackie and David had fought their way through the storm, their SUV crawling through unplowed streets, each contraction marking time like a metronome of pain. The usual 20-minute drive had taken over an hour, with David gripping the wheel and Jackie fighting to stay calm, both remembering their losses, the nursery they'd painted 3 times over the years, only to be left empty. The maternity ward itself told a story of stark contrasts. The recently renovated private rooms featured soft lighting, state-of-the-art equipment, and comfortable furnishings, a $50 million project David had overseen just last year. Yet beneath the surface luxury lurked uncomfortable truth, statistics showing higher mortality rates for black mothers, internal reports of discrimination filed away in HR offices, and the whispered experiences of minority patients that never made it into official records. The night shift staff moved through their routines against a backdrop of institutional history. Memorial had been one of the first hospitals in the state to integrate its wards in the 1960s, a fact proudly displayed on plaques in the lobby. But old habits died hard, and bias worked in subtle ways, which patients were offered pain medication first, whose complaints were prioritized, whose concerns were dismissed as anxiety. The storm outside had forced the hospital to operate on limited staff. 3 nurses had called out, unable to make it through the weather, leaving Nancy in charge of more patients than usual. The pressure added another layer of tension to an already strained environment. In the break room, a TV murmured news about closed roads and power outages, while the skeletal crew discussed which patients needed the most attention. Through the large windows of Jackie's private room, the city lights flickered against the snow, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. The room itself was a symbol of privilege, the kind of care everyone deserved but few received. David had insisted on the best room, though Jackie had protested, wanting no special treatment. Now that same room felt like a gilded cage, where her medical knowledge and social status counted for nothing against deeply rooted prejudices. The night shift brought its own rhythm, the soft beeping of monitors, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the distant ding of elevator doors. In the hallway, charts were updated, shifts changed, and silent observations were made. Sarah Chin, the resident, sat at the nurse's station, her carefully documented notes about Nancy's behavior hidden beneath routine paperwork, growing longer with each passing hour. The storm showed no signs of letting up, effectively cutting off the hospital from easy access to additional help or patient transfers. Dr. Sullivan, who had been about to end his shift, decided to stay, something in his gut telling him he might be needed. He stood by a window watching the snow transform the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous, much like how bias could transform a place of healing into something else entirely. In this enclosed ecosystem of medical hierarchy and human drama, the stage was set for a night that would force everyone involved to confront their own prejudices, power, and responsibility. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within these walls. The first warning sign came at 7:42 p.m., when Jackie's water broke in a rush of clear fluid tinged with an unmistakable shade of green. As a pediatric nurse, she immediately recognized the meconium staining, a potential sign of fetal distress. Her medical training kicked in, overriding her personal fear. "There's meconium present," Jackie reported to Nancy, who had just entered the room for her initial assessment, "and the contractions are already less than 3 minutes apart." Nancy barely glanced up from her clipboard, her fingers mechanically recording vitals. Hashem. "First babies often take their time, regardless of contraction patterns. We'll monitor it." Her tone carried the same dismissive note she'd used countless times before, a subtle undermining that made Jackie's skin prickle. David, still shaking snow from his coat, caught the exchange. He moved closer to Jackie's bed, his presence both protective and uncertain. "Shouldn't we alert the doctor about the meconium?" he asked, his executive authority wavering in this unfamiliar territory. "Mr. Thompson," Nancy's voice took on a practiced patience, "I understand your concern, but this is quite common. We don't need to alarm anyone unnecessarily." She emphasized unnecessarily with the slightest arch of her eyebrow, a gesture that spoke volumes about her assessment of their concerns. Jackie breathed through another contraction more intense than the last. Her medical training screamed warnings: the rapid progression, the meconium, the increasing pressure. "Something feels different," she managed between breaths. "This isn't normal first labor progression." Nancy's response came with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Every mother thinks her pain is special. Trust me, this is all perfectly standard." She made a small notation in the chart: "Patient anxious, overreacting to normal labor processes." The dismissal stung worse than the contraction. Jackie had spent years working alongside doctors and nurses, had handled countless medical emergencies, had even taught new residents about recognizing critical situations. Yet here she sat, her medical knowledge and bodily awareness dismissed with a few patronizing words. David watched helplessly as his wife's professional dignity crumbled under Nancy's subtle prejudice. He'd seen this before in management meetings, the way certain voices were systematically undermined, certain concerns automatically downgraded. But never had it felt so personal, so dangerous. Outside the window, the storm intensified, snow now falling so thick it obscured the city lights. The maternity ward grew quieter as visitors were forced to leave early due to weather conditions. Jackie gripped the bed rails through another contraction, this one bringing a pain so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. "Please," she whispered, more to herself than to Nancy's retreating back. "Something isn't right." But Nancy was already gone, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor as she moved on to her next patient, leaving behind a room heavy with unspoken fears and mounting tension. In the silence that followed, monitors beeped steadily, snow pelted the windows, and Jackie felt the first real tendrils of fear take root in her chest. The next hour brought a subtle but significant shift in the delivery room's atmosphere. Jackie's contractions intensified rapidly, each wave stronger than medical textbooks suggested they should be at this stage. Through the fog of mounting pain, she noticed the younger nurses exchanging worried glances whenever they checked her vitals. Sarah Chen, the first-year resident, lingered longer than necessary during her routine check. "Your blood pressure's climbing," she murmured, her eyes darting to the door where Nancy had just passed. "I'll keep monitoring it closely." Her hesitation spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the growing concern she dared not voice openly. The pain changed character, no longer the rhythmic waves of normal labor, but something sharper, more insistent. Jackie recognized the warning signs of potential complications from her years in pediatric care. "The baby's heart rate drops during contractions," she told David, her professional knowledge battling with her increasing anxiety. "We need continuous monitoring." Nancy returned, clipboard in hand, her demeanor unchanged despite the escalating situation. "Still making a fuss?" she asked, the question loaded with assumptions. In the corner, David's hands clenched into fists, his hospital administrator's composure cracking. "My wife is telling you something's wrong," he started, but Nancy cut him off with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Thompson, with all due respect, your position doesn't give you medical expertise. Some patients just have a lower pain tolerance." The emphasis on some carried ugly undertones that made the room temperature seem to drop further. Through the window, the storm transformed the hospital grounds into a white wasteland, effectively cutting off easy access to additional medical support. The regular staff whispered in hallways about the weather, about Jackie, about Nancy's history with similar cases. Their hushed conversations carried decades of institutional bias, of situations where concerns were dismissed until it was almost too late. Jackie's latest vitals showed warning signs that any medical professional should have flagged elevated blood pressure, irregular contractions concerning fetal heart rate patterns. Yet Nancy's notes continued to minimize patient continues to exaggerate symptoms. We'll monitor. Sarah Chen slipped another detailed observation into her growing file, hidden in her locker. Patient JT, clear signs of distress ignored. Staff NW dismissed legitimate medical concerns. Pattern continues. The tension peaked when Jackie attempted to explain her symptoms using medical terminology, drawing from her professional background. Nancy's response was immediate and cutting. Let's leave the medical assessments to those currently practicing in obstetrics, shall we? In that moment, something shifted in the room's dynamics. David's authority as CO collided with Nancy's territorial control over her domain. Jackie's medical knowledge battled against prejudiced assumptions about her pain tolerance. And underneath it all, the steady beep of monitors told a story that someone needed to hear before it was too late. As another contraction gripped her, Jackie caught her reflection in the window, a professional woman reduced to just another stereotype, fighting to be heard while time slipped away like the snow outside, relentless and unforgiving. Through waves of pain, I caught my reflection in the window, our story burning in my chest. If you believe in justice, in voices that deserve to be heard, in changing broken systems, hit that subscribe button. Together we can ensure no mother's pain is ever dismissed again. Your support keeps our truth alive. At 9:15 p.m., Jackie's world narrowed to a single point of searing pain. The monitor screamed warnings as her blood pressure spiked dangerously high, each reading more alarming than the last. Through her medical training, she recognized the telltale signs of preeclampsia, but her voice had become a whisper in a storm no one wanted to hear. David, she gasped between contractions that now came like tidal waves, the baby's heart rate. Its decelerating, her fingers gripped the bed rail until her knuckles turned white. Late decelerations, it means the baby's in distress, he finished, his COO composure finally shattering. He jabbed the call button repeatedly, his free hand clutching Jackie's. The room's temperature seemed to drop with each passing second, the winter storm outside a mirror of the crisis unfolding within. Nancy swept in, irritation evident in every line of her face. Mr. Thompson, constantly pressing the call button won't speed things along. This is perfectly normal. Don't you dare say normal, David's voice cracked like thunder. Look at the monitors. Actually, look. For a moment, Nancy's professional mask slipped, revealing something darker underneath a flash of defiance, of deep-seated prejudice masked as medical judgment. Sir, I understand your concern, but your wife is progressing exactly as expected for someone in her demographic. The word hung in the air like poison. Jackie, fighting through another contraction, caught Sarah Chen's eye as the resident hovered by the door. The young doctor's face showed a battle between professional duty and institutional hierarchy. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her tablet, where her documented evidence of Nancy's discrimination grew by the minute. Blood pressure 160/100, Sarah announced quietly, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. Patient showing signs of severe preeclampsia. Nancy's head snapped toward Sarah, her eyes narrowing. Dr. Chen, might I remind you of your position? When you've handled as many deliveries as I have, when you've handled as many emergencies as I have, Jackie interrupted, her professional dignity finally overriding her pain, you learn to recognize when something's wrong. I've spent 10 years saving children in this hospital. I know. Mrs. Thompson, Nancy cut in, her voice dripping with condescension. Your experience with sick children hardly qualifies you to. The monitor's alarm cut through their argument like a knife. Jackie's blood pressure had spiked to 180/110, and the baby's heart rate plummeted during the next contraction. David lunged for the door, but Nancy blocked his path. If you disrupt the doctor and surgery for normal labor progression, you'll create unnecessary panic. I've seen this 100 times. Black women often. Often what David's voice was deadly quiet. Often exaggerate, often complain. Choose your next words very carefully, Nancy, because right now you're gambling with my wife's life based on nothing but prejudice. Outside, the storm hurled itself against the windows with renewed fury, and the hospital lights flickered ominously. Jackie felt consciousness slipping away at the edges, her years of medical training telling her exactly what was happening and exactly how dangerous it was. Through the haze, she heard Sarah Chin's voice, trembling but determined. "I'm calling Dr. Sullivan. Now." Nancy turned, her face contorted with rage, but before she could speak, Jackie saw something that made her blood run cold. Despite her fever, a flash of recognition in Nancy's eyes, quickly buried under layers of denial. In that split second, Jackie realized Nancy knew her from somewhere, knew her face, but the prejudice clouding her judgment was too thick to let the memory surface. The room spun, monitors blared, and Jackie's last coherent thought was of bitter irony. She was dying in the very hospital she'd given her life to, killed by the same prejudices she'd fought against for years. Dr. Sullivan burst through the door just as Nancy reached to silence another monitor alarm. The chaos in the room froze for a heartbeat as he assessed the situation with experienced eyes. But it was the photograph falling from Nancy's pocket that shattered the moment, a worn picture that fluttered to the floor like a leaf in the winter wind. Jackie, fighting to maintain consciousness, glimpsed the image, a small boy in a hospital bed, tubes everywhere, with a younger Nancy crying beside him. But it was the figure in the background that caused her breath to catch, herself 5 years younger, adjusting the child's ventilator. That's Tommy," Jackie whispered, the memory cutting through her pain. "Your son. Code Blue, Pediatric ICU, Christmas Eve 2019. Nancy froze, color draining from her face as recognition finally broke through her prejudice. The photograph trembled in her hands as the memory rushed back, her son turning blue, alarm screaming, and a young black nurse who refused to give up, who worked for hours after her shift ended, who saved Tommy's life when everyone else had lost hope. "You," Nancy breathed, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "It was you." Dr. Sullivan's voice cut through the revelation. "Patient's BP 190/120, severe preeclampsia, possible placental abruption. We need an OR now." But Nancy stood paralyzed, staring at Jackie as 5 years of buried guilt crashed through her professional facade. The same woman she'd been dismissing for hours had once been her son's guardian angel. The same hands she'd ignored clutching the bedrail had once performed the chest compressions that kept Tommy alive. "I didn't. I never." Nancy's voice cracked, her prejudices warring with the undeniable truth before her. Later, Dr. Sullivan commanded, taking control. "Right now we save them both. Nancy, either help or get out." Sarah Chin appeared with a crash cart, her documented evidence of Nancy's discrimination forgotten in the urgency of the moment. The young resident's eyes met Nancy's, challenging her to choose to remain trapped in her prejudice, or to remember why she became a nurse in the first place. Jackie's vision blurred as another contraction hit, but through the pain she saw Nancy's transformation. The nurse's hand, steady now, moved with purpose as she helped prepare for emergency transport. Her voice, stripped of condescension, rattled off vital signs and medical history to the approaching surgical team. 5 years, Nancy whispered as they wheeled Jackie toward the OR, her words barely audible above the chaos. "For 5 years I've carried your picture with his, never connecting, never seeing." David, running alongside the gurney, caught fragments of their exchange. His face showed the dawning realization that the woman who had saved his wife's career, the nurse Jackie had stayed late to mentor after that Christmas Eve miracle, was the same one who had nearly destroyed everything tonight. The storm outside reached its peak as they rushed through the corridors, thunder cracking like judgment from above. Jackie felt herself slipping away, the edges of her world growing dark. But before consciousness faded completely, she heard Nancy's voice one last time, no longer dismissive, but broken and human. "I forgot why I became a nurse. I forgot until I saw. Until I remembered. Please don't let my failure tonight." The organ doors swung open, cutting off Nancy's words. As the anesthesia took hold, Jackie's last thought was of life's cruel ironies, how prejudice had blinded Nancy to the very person who had given her back her son, and how it had taken another crisis to finally break through those walls of bias. The first plot twist had detonated, but its shockwaves were just beginning to spread through Memorial Hospital's halls. The operating room erupted into controlled chaos as Dr. Sullivan barked orders through his surgical mask. Outside in the sterile hallway, Nancy sat crumpled against the wall, the worn photograph clutched to her chest, while David paced like a caged lion, his phone pressed to his ear. "Get me everything on Nancy Weber's patient complaints," he demanded, his CEO voice breaking through his personal anguish. "Every incident, every report, everything HR has buried, now." Sarah Chen approached cautiously, her tablet shaking in her hands. "Mr. Thompson, I have documentation. 3 months' worth." She swiped through her detailed notes, dates, times, patient demographics, patterns of discrimination. "I've been tracking her behavior, especially with minority patients. The statistics are significant." Inside the ER, Jackie's blood pressure continued to spiral dangerously. The metallic scent of blood filled the air as Dr. Sullivan worked against time. "More suction," he ordered, his voice tight. "We're losing her." The baby's heart rate plummeted again, the monitor's shrill alarm piercing through the professional facade of the surgical team. A nurse called out readings that painted an increasingly desperate picture. BP dropping to 70/40. Fetal heartbeat irregular. Blood loss critical. Through the ER door's window, David caught glimpses of the nightmare unfolding, his hands pressed against the glass, leaving ghost-like prints on the cold surface. Behind him, Nancy's quiet sobs provided a haunting soundtrack to the crisis. "I didn't see," she whispered repeatedly. "I didn't want to see." The storm outside reached a crescendo, rattling the hospital windows. The lights flickered ominously, and for one terrifying moment, the backup generators hummed to life before the main power restored itself. Sarah's tablet revealed a damning pattern. African American mothers were 3 times more likely to have their pain dismissed under Nancy's care. Hispanic patients waited an average of 40 minutes longer for pain medication. Asian mothers were consistently labeled as overreacting in their charts. "It's all here," Sarah explained, her voice gathering strength. "Last month, Mrs. Rodriguez complained of severe pain. Nancy documented it as dramatic behavior typical of her cultural background. Mrs. Rodriguez hemorrhaged an hour later. 2 weeks ago, Ms. Kim reported unusual symptoms. Nancy wrote it off as anxiety. She lost the baby." David's face hardened with each revelation. How long has administration known? There were reports, Sarah admitted, but they were classified as unsubstantiated complaints. Nancy's technical skills were excellent. Her bias was subtle, unless you were looking for it. Inside the OR, Dr. Sullivan fought his own battle with institutional racism's consequences. "Pushing more blood products," he announced. "Where's that second IV line?" Jackie's vitals continued their dangerous dance on the monitors. The baby's distress had become critical. Years of medical training, of saving other people's children, now hung by a thread as Jackie lay unconscious, her life depending on the very system she'd served faithfully for a decade. Nancy staggered to her feet, the photograph falling from her trembling hands. It landed face up, showing the moment of Tommy's recovery, Jackie adjusting his oxygen while Nancy hugged her son. The contrast between that moment of joy and the current crisis was stark enough to draw a gasp from Sarah. "That's her, isn't it?" Sarah asked softly. "The nurse everyone talks about? The one who worked a triple shift on Christmas Eve to save a dying boy." Nancy nodded, tears streaming down her face. She didn't see color that night. She just saw my son. And tonight, her voice broke. I couldn't see past my own prejudice to recognize the woman who gave me back my child. The organ doors burst open as another crash cart arrived. Fresh blood products were rushed in as Jackie's condition deteriorated further. Dr. Sullivan's commands became more urgent, his normally calm demeanor showing cracks of concern. David turned to Nancy, his voice raw with emotion. "You carried her picture for 5 years without seeing her. How many other lives have you dismissed? How many other families have suffered because you couldn't see past your prejudice?" The question hung in the air like the storm clouds outside, heavy with accountability and consequence. Down the hall, other nurses watched the unfolding drama, their own biases and assumptions suddenly uncomfortable mirrors they couldn't avoid. Sarah's tablet continued to tell its damning story, numbers, dates, patterns of discrimination that could no longer be ignored. The mounting crisis wasn't just about Jackie anymore. It was about every patient who had suffered in silence, every complaint dismissed, every life put at risk by systemic prejudice wearing a nurse's uniform. The hospital's administrative machinery began to grind into motion as news of the crisis spread through the building. Emergency board members were called despite the storm, their cars creating dark caravans through the snow. In his office, the hospital CEO, Marcus Peterson, stared at the growing stack of complaints on his desk, all previously buried, all now demanding immediate attention. "This doesn't look good," Marcus board member Elizabeth Chin, Sarah's aunt, spoke sharply through the speakerphone. "Akua's wife fighting for her life because of documented racial bias? The press will crucify us." In the hallway outside the OR, the conflict deepened on multiple fronts. Nancy, still processing her devastating realization, found herself facing the consequences of years of discriminatory practices. Other nurses began coming forward, their silence finally breaking. "She told me to ignore Mrs. Washington's complaints last week," one nurse admitted to Sarah, who continued documenting everything. "Said some people just want attention. Mrs. Washington lost her baby the next day." The young resident's tablet had become a repository of painful truths, dozens of incidents, countless lives affected, a pattern too clear to deny. But it wasn't just Nancy's behavior under scrutiny anymore, it was the entire system that had allowed it to continue. Dr. Sullivan emerged briefly from his surgical cap stained with sweat. "We're stabilizing her, but it's touch and go. The baby," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "We need to get them both through the next hour." He pulled David aside, speaking in low tones. "This isn't just about tonight. I've seen this before too many times. When I was a resident, my concerns were dismissed, just like Jackie's. I learned to stay quiet, to work within the system. Maybe that was a mistake." The revelation hit David hard. Even his trusted chief of obstetrics had been complicit in his silence, choosing career preservation over confrontation. The problem ran deeper than one prejudiced nurse. It was rooted in the very foundation of the institution. Down in HR files were being hastily reviewed. Complaints that had been marked resolved or unsubstantiated told a different story when viewed together. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Minority patients consistently received different treatment, their concerns minimized, their pain dismissed. Nancy, still keeping her vigil outside the OR, began to speak, her words tumbling out like a confession. "After Tommy. After Jackie saved him, I couldn't handle the guilt. Seeing black nurses succeed, watching them save lives while I had failed my own son, I twisted it, made it about race instead of facing my own inadequacies." Sarah continued typing, documenting this crucial admission, but her hands shook with suppressed anger. "And how many mothers suffered because of your twist?" she asked quietly. The snow continued to fall outside, but now other stories emerged from the white silence. Nurses from different departments arrived despite the weather, drawn by the unfolding crisis. Each brought their own experiences, their own witnesses to systemic bias. Remember Maria Gonzalez and Dr. Patel's concerns about the maternity protocols. What about last month's incident with the Chin family? The hospital's carefully maintained facade of equality began to crack, revealing the rot beneath. David found himself facing an impossible choice: protect the institution he'd helped build, or tear it down to its foundations to root out the cancer of prejudice. In the boardroom, Marcus Peterson faced his own crisis. "We need to get ahead of this," he insisted to the emergency board meeting. "Issue a statement, show we're taking action." Taking action, Elizabeth Chin's voice cracked through the speaker. "Like we did with the last 6 complaints. The ones we buried to protect the hospital's reputation." The conflict had expanded beyond Jackie's operating room, beyond Nancy's prejudice, beyond even the hospital's walls. It had become a moment of reckoning for an entire institution, forcing everyone to confront their role in maintaining a system that valued some lives above others. Through the windows, Jackie's monitors continued their ominous dance of warning lights and alarms. But now they seemed to be sounding an alarm for something larger, a wake-up call for a system that had been sleepwalking through its own prejudices for far too long. Sarah looked at her tablet, at the growing document that would eventually shake the hospital to its core, and made a decision. "I'm sending this to every board member," she announced. "Every documented incident, every dismissed complaint, every life affected. It ends tonight." At 11:42 p.m., all hell broke loose in Operating Room 3. Jackie's heart monitor flatlined, its steady tone cutting through the controlled chaos like a knife. Dr. Sullivan's voice remained steady, but his hands betrayed the urgency of the moment. Beginning chest compressions. "Push 1 of EPI. Where's that crash cart?" Through the window, David watched helplessly as the medical team fought to save his wife and unborn child. The harsh fluorescent lights cast everything in a surreal glow, making the scene look like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. BP dropping catastrophically. Baby's heartbeat irregular. "We're losing them both." Nancy, still stationed outside, suddenly straightened. Her years of experience cut through her guilt and shame, recognizing a critical detail others had missed. "Wait," she burst through the doors, protocol forgotten. "Check her for amniotic embolism. The symptoms match what she was trying to tell us hours ago." Dr. Sullivan's hands never stopped moving as he processed this information. "She said something felt wrong from the beginning," he muttered. "If we'd listened." The next few minutes became a blur of medical terminology and desperate measures. The storm outside reached its peak, rattling the windows with apocalyptic fury. The hospital's lights flickered once, twice, before the backup generators kicked in with a low hum. In the observation area, Sarah Chin frantically documented everything, her tablet becoming a record of life and death decisions made in split seconds. But it was her next action that would change everything. "Mr. Thompson," she called to David, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm going live with the documentation, all of it. Now." David turned from the window, his face etched with anguish. "Do it." With trembling fingers, Sarah pressed send on an email that would reach every board member, every department head, and selected media outlets. Years of documented discrimination, including tonight's events, rushed through the hospital's digital veins like a virus of truth. Inside the Jackie's heart stuttered back to life, but the battle wasn't over. The baby's vitals continued to deteriorate, forcing Dr. Sullivan to make an impossible choice. "We need to deliver now," he announced. "No time for prep. Nancy, if you're staying, scrub in. We need every experienced hand." Nancy moved without hesitation, her previous prejudices burned away by the heat of crisis. As she scrubbed alongside Dr. Sullivan, he spoke without looking at her. "You know what happens after this," he said quietly. regardless of the outcome. "I know," she replied, her voice steady for the first time that night. "But right now, let me try to save the woman who saved my son." The surgery proceeded with the intensity of a battlefield operation. Each minute brought new complications, each decision carried the weight of 2 lives. David pressed his forehead against the cold window, his breath fogging the glass, watching as his wife's blood painted the surgical drapes crimson. Through the hospital's corridors, Sarah's email began its work. Phones buzzed in board members' pockets. Emergency meetings were called. The hospital's PR team was awakened to find their worst nightmare unfolding in real time. But in or 3, none of that mattered. Jackie's life hung by a thread, her baby's heartbeat growing weaker with each passing second. The medical team moved in choreographed desperation, their previous hierarchies and prejudice forgotten in the fight to save 2 lives. "She's crashing again. Baby's oxygen levels critical. We need to move now." Dr. Sullivan made the cut with surgical precision, his years of experience guiding his hands through the chaos. Nancy assisted without hesitation, her movements sure despite the tears streaming behind her surgical mask. The storm reached a crescendo outside, thunder cracking like judgment from above. In that moment, as life and death balanced on a scalpel's edge, the hospital's power failed completely. The backup generators sputtered, leaving only the emergency surgical lights casting their weak glow over the scene. In that dim light, Dr. Sullivan looked up at his team, their faces ghostly behind their masks. "This is it," he said quietly. "Everything we've got, now." The next few minutes would change everything, not just for Jackie and her baby, but for Memorial Hospital itself. In the darkness of a winter storm, with truth and consequences flooding through the hospital's digital networks, 2 lives hung in the balance, their fate resting in the hands of the very system that had failed them. As Dr. Sullivan worked against time to deliver Jackie's baby, a second crisis erupted when the hospital's backup generators failed completely. The emergency surgical lights provided the only illumination, casting long shadows across the OR. But it was in this moment of near darkness that the second revelation struck. Dr. Sullivan's voice cut through the chaos, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the current emergency. "Nancy," he said, never taking his eyes off his patient, "do you remember a case from 15 years ago? A young black resident who reported discriminatory practices. The one who was forced to resign." Nancy's hands froze for a split second. "That was the Williams case. The hospital buried it. But how?" "That resident was me," Dr. Sullivan revealed, his hands never stopping their life-saving work. "I was forced out of Memorial, only to return years later as chief of obstetrics. I've spent a decade working within the system, documenting every case like Jackie's, building evidence while playing their game." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Dr. Sullivan, the quiet, professional chief who had always seemed to work so smoothly within the system, had been orchestrating his own investigation all along. "Sarah's documentation isn't the only record," he continued, his voice steady as he worked to deliver Jackie's baby. "I have 15 years of evidence. Every dismissed complaint, every buried report, every case of bias that the administration chose to ignore. Tonight wasn't just about Jackie, it was the final piece I needed." Through the window, David's face showed dawning comprehension. The late-night Sullivan spent in his office, the careful way he documented every case, his insistence on being present for high-risk deliveries, it had all been part of a larger plan. "Got you," Sarah whispered, her fingers flying across her tablet. "Dr. Sullivan has been working with the state medical board, his evidence combined with mine." The baby emerged into the dim light, silent and blue. As Nancy moved to assist with resuscitation, Dr. Sullivan delivered his final revelation. "Nancy, your son's case was the one that brought me back. I tracked every incident since then, including your pattern of discrimination. I wanted to understand how a nurse whose life was saved by a black medical professional, could turn around and perpetuate the same bias that almost destroyed my career. The baby's first cry pierced the darkness just as the main power hummed back to life. But the real shock came from Nancy's direction. "I knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the monitors. "I knew it was you. That's why. That's why I fought so hard against every black doctor who reminded me of my shame. When you came back as chief, I couldn't face what I'd become." Jackie's vital signs began to stabilize, but the revelations continued to rock the ore. Dr. Sullivan had built his case methodically, using his position to gather evidence while appearing to be the model of institutional compliance. Every dismissed complaint, every ignored warning had been documented, creating an irrefutable record of systemic discrimination. "The State Medical Board receives my final report tonight," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of careful planning. "With Sarah's additional documentation and tonight's events, the hospital will face a full investigation. The entire system will be examined, not just individual cases." Outside in the hallway, hospital administrators who had arrived despite the storm found their phones buzzing with notifications. The State Medical Board was already moving, their investigation launching even as Jackie fought for her life in the ore. David, still pressed against the window, watched as his wife's color began to return. The baby's cries grew stronger, a testament to life persisting despite the system's failures. But his mind was racing with the implications of Sullivan's revelation. The chief of obstetrics had been playing a long game, using his position to expose the very discrimination that had once nearly ended his career. As dawn approached, the storm began to ease, but the hospital faced a different kind of reckoning. Dr. Sullivan's years of careful documentation, combined with Sarah's recent evidence and the dramatic events of the night, had created a perfect storm of accountability. The second plot twist had transformed what seemed to be a single case of discrimination into something far larger, a systematic expose of institutional racism, orchestrated by a man who had turned his own experience of injustice into a weapon for change. Through the haze of recovery, I caught my reflection again, both survivor and witness to a system's failure. Our story needs to be heard. Hit subscribe to amplify voices like mine to ensure every patient's pain matters. Together, we can heal more than just bodies. We can heal the system itself. Justice in healthcare. In the pale light of dawn, as the storm finally subsided, the true cost of the night's events began to crystallize. Jackie lay in recovery, her body battered by both medical crisis and institutional betrayal. The baby, though stable, had spent precious minutes fighting for life, minutes that could have been avoided if her mother's concerns had been heeded earlier. David sat between them, his hand resting on the incubator while maintaining contact with Jackie's arm, trying to bridge the gap between his wife and daughter. His other hand still clutched his phone, where messages about the unfolding investigation piled up unanswered. "She's beautiful," Jackie whispered, her voice raw from the intubation. "But I can't hold her yet." The physical distance between mother and child seemed to embody everything that had gone wrong, a separation forced by prejudice and negligence. Nancy stood in the doorway, stripped of her usual confidence, watching the family she had nearly destroyed. The photograph of Tommy was still clutched in her hand, now creased and worn from the night's events. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words seemed adequate. "Do you know what it feels like?" Jackie asked, suddenly her medical training giving weight to her words. "To know exactly what's happening to your body, to recognize every warning sign, and still be ignored. To have years of medical experience dismissed because of the color of your skin." David's grip tightened on the incubator. "We trusted the system," he said quietly. "I helped build it. All those diversity initiatives, all those programs. And my own wife nearly died because of the very bias I thought we'd addressed." The baby stirred in her incubator, her tiny fingers grasping at air. Jackie struggled to sit up, wincing at the surgical pain, desperate to close the distance she couldn't yet bridge. A tear rolled down her cheek as she watched her daughter through the clear plastic barrier. I've held so many babies in PCU, she said, her voice breaking. Comforted so many mothers. And now I can't even hold my own daughter because she couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah Chen appeared with her tablet, still documenting, still bearing witness. But her usual professional demeanor cracked as she watched Jackie struggle with the physical and emotional aftermath. Your case isn't the only one, Sarah admitted softly, but it might be the one that finally forces change. The cost. She glanced at the incubator, at Jackie's pain-lined face, at David's haunted expression. The personal cost shouldn't have been so high. Outside in the corridor, other nurses whispered about their own complicity, times they'd seen bias but stayed silent, moments they'd chosen career safety over patient advocacy. The weight of collective guilt hung heavy in the air. Nancy finally stepped forward, her movement drawing all eyes. I can't undo what I did, she began, her voice thick with emotion. I can't give you back those hours of pain, that precious time with your daughter. I let my own trauma twist into something ugly, something that nearly cost you everything. Jackie met her gaze steadily. The same hands that saved your son nearly killed my daughter, she said quietly. That's the price of prejudice, Nancy. It doesn't just hurt the victim, it corrupts the perpetrator too. The morning sun finally broke through the snow clouds, casting long shadows across the recovery room. In its harsh light, every cost became visible: the physical scars Jackie would carry, the emotional trauma that would linger, the trust in the medical system that lay shattered like glass on the floor. The baby's monitoring machines beeped steadily, a reminder of both survival and what was nearly lost. In that sterile room, surrounded by the aftermath of bias, each person faced their own reckoning with the personal cost of systemic racism. As morning rounds began, Memorial Hospital found itself under a microscope of its own making. In the hospital's main conference room, the emergency board meeting had turned into a grim accounting of systemic failures. 15 years of documented bias, Elizabeth Chen read from Dr. Sullivan's report, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. 732 cases of dismissed complaints from minority patients, 43 preventable complications, 12 deaths. The numbers echoed through the room like body counts from a hidden war. Each statistic represented a person whose pain had been minimized, whose concerns had been ignored, whose life had been deemed somehow less valuable. Marcus Peterson, the hospital CEO, aged visibly as the evidence mounted. How did we miss this, he asked, but the question rang hollow. We didn't miss it, Dr. Sullivan replied. Standing at the boardroom window, we chose not to see it. Every time HR buried a complaint, every time administration dismissed a concern, every time we prioritized reputation over reform, we chose blindness. Slides appeared on the conference room screen, graphs showing racial disparities in pain management, charts documenting longer wait times for minority patients, statistics revealing higher complication rates among non-white mothers. The system didn't fail, Sarah Chen added, her tablet displaying her own meticulous documentation. It worked exactly as designed to protect itself, to maintain the status quo, to silence those who spoke up. Down in the recovery ward, Jackie's case had become a rallying point. Nurses gathered in break rooms, sharing their own stories of witnessed discrimination. The long-maintained walls of silence began to crumble. Remember Mrs. Rodriguez last summer? And Dr. Patel's concerns about emergency room protocols. The Williams family's lawsuit that mysteriously disappeared. Each revelation exposed another crack in the foundation, another instance where the system had chosen institutional protection over patient care. In his office, David stared at his own culpability. His diversity initiatives now seemed like band-aids on a gaping wound, superficial solutions that had allowed the underlying infection to fester. We created a system that looked progressive on paper, he admitted to Dr. Sullivan, while preserving the very biases we claimed to fight. The failure wasn't just in individual actions or personal prejudices. It was woven into the hospital's policies, embedded in its protocols, hidden in the seemingly neutral language of its procedures. Nancy's case files revealed a pattern of escalating bias enabled by an administration more concerned with liability than accountability. Her evaluations praised her efficiency while ignoring the human cost of her prejudice. The system didn't just fail Jackie, Dr. Sullivan observed. It failed every patient who came before her. It failed every healthcare worker who tried to speak up. It even failed Nancy by never challenging her biases, by allowing her trauma to transform into discrimination. Outside Jackie's recovery room, the morning shift change brought fresh eyes to the crisis. New nurses read the overnight reports with growing horror, realizing they were witnessing a turning point in the hospital's history. The systemic failures had created a perfect storm of prejudiced nurse, enabled by biased policies, protected by bureaucratic indifference, nearly causing a tragedy that could no longer be ignored. In the boardroom, Elizabeth Chen stood up. "We're not just looking at individual incidents anymore," she declared. "We're seeing the complete failure of our institutional integrity. Every policy, every procedure, every aspect of patient care needs to be re-examined." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the hospital corridors, illuminating the cracks in a system that had prioritized appearance over substance, protocol over people, institutional stability over individual lives. The question was no longer whether the system had failed, but how many lives had been impacted by that failure and whether the institution could survive the reckoning that was coming. The afternoon brought a series of developments that no one at Memorial Hospital could have predicted. As Jackie rested in recovery, finally able to hold her daughter, a remarkable scene unfolded in the hospital's main lobby. Dozens of former patients began arriving despite the treacherous post-storm conditions. They came with their stories, their medical records, their experiences of bias drawn by Sarah Chen's viral documentation and Dr. Sullivan's exposed investigation. But what happened next stunned everyone. Nancy Weber stepped into the lobby still wearing her scrubs and did something unprecedented. She began to listen. "I was wrong," she announced to the growing crowd. "Not just about Jackie, but about every patient I dismissed. And I want to hear your stories, all of them." The lobby transformed into an impromptu testimony center. Nancy sat with each person, documenting their experiences, validating their pain, her own transformation becoming a catalyst for broader change. Upstairs, Dr. Sullivan received an unexpected call. The state medical board wasn't just launching an investigation, they wanted him to lead a new task force on healthcare discrimination. "We need someone who understands both sides of the system," the board chairman explained. "Someone who experienced the bias and fought it from within. Your 15-year investigation proves you're that person." But the most surprising development came from David Thompson. In the hospital's main conference room, he stood before the board with a radical proposal. "We're not just going to reform," he announced, "we're going to rebuild." Starting with this, he slid a document across the table, his resignation as cool. "I'm stepping down to create a new position, Chief of Patient Advocacy and Equity, and I'm recommending Jackie for the role." The boardroom erupted in shocked murmurs, but David wasn't finished. Who better to transform our system than someone who's experienced both sides of it? A skilled medical professional who nearly became a victim of our failures. In the recovery room, Sarah Chen showed Jackie the scene unfolding in the lobby on her tablet. Former patients sharing their stories, Nancy listening with tears streaming down her face, current hospital staff joining in with their own testimonies. "It's becoming a movement," Sarah explained. "They're calling it the Memorial Revolution." But the most unexpected development walked through Jackie's door wearing a white coat and carrying a familiar photograph. Tommy Weber, Nancy's son, now a first-year medical student at Harvard. "I never knew," he said softly, looking at Jackie. "That night in PQ I was too sick to remember. But Mom finally told me everything, about how you saved me, about how she nearly..." His voice broke. "I'm transferring my residency here," he announced, "to be part of the change, to help make sure no other patient experiences what you did." The day's developments rippled through the hospital like waves of transformation. Nancy's public acknowledgement of her bias and willingness to listen sparked a chain reaction. Other healthcare workers began coming forward, admitting their own biases, committing to change. Dr. Sullivan's appointment to the State Medical Board task force elevated the issue beyond Memorial's walls, promising systemic change at a state level. And David's decision to step down and create a new position centered on patient advocacy sent a clear message: the old system of token reforms and surface-level diversity initiatives was over. As evening approached, Jackie sat in her recovery room, holding her daughter while Tommy shared his medical school experiences. Outside her window, the sun broke through the last of the storm clouds, casting a golden light across the snow-covered hospital grounds. Sarah Chin, still documenting everything, looked up from her tablet with a smile. Sometimes, she said, it takes a perfect storm to wash away the old and make room for something new. The unexpected developments of that day would later be marked as the beginning of real change, not just at Memorial Hospital but in healthcare institutions across the state. Sometimes transformation comes from the most unexpected sources: a prejudiced nurse's redemption, a patient's triumph, and a system's willingness to finally face its failures. As the first week after the Memorial incident drew to a close, the seeds of resolution began taking root in unexpected ways. The hospital's transformation started not with grand policy changes, but with small, profound human moments. In the hospital's newly established Truth and Reconciliation Room, Nancy sat across from the Rodriguez family, whose daughter she had dismissed months earlier. Her hands trembled as she handed them Tommy's photograph. "My son lives because a black nurse refused to give up," she said softly. "I dishonored her gift by becoming what I once fought against. But if you're willing to share your story, I'm ready to listen." Dr. Sullivan's task force took an unprecedented approach. Instead of closed-door meetings, they set up public forums in the hospital auditorium. Patients, families, and healthcare workers shared their experiences while administrators were required to attend and listen. "We're not here to defend or explain," Dr. Sullivan announced at the first session. "We're here to understand the human cost of our failures." Jackie, still recovering but growing stronger, received an unexpected visit from the hospital's board. They didn't come with corporate speeches or carefully crafted apologies. Instead, they came with a proposal. "We want to create a new standard of care," Elizabeth Chin explained. "The Jackie Thompson Protocol, requiring healthcare providers to document and address every patient concern, regardless of demographic. But we need you to help design it." David's transition from CUO to creating the new advocacy department sparked a chain reaction. Other hospitals in the region began reaching out, asking about implementing similar changes. The Memorial Revolution was spreading. Sarah Chin's documentation, combined with Dr. Sullivan's 15 years of evidence, became the foundation for a new medical school curriculum on bias in healthcare. Memorial Hospital would serve as both warning and model for change. But the most powerful resolution began in the NICU, where Jackie's daughter was finally strong enough to leave the incubator. As she held her baby properly for the first time, something remarkable happened. Nancy's son Tommy, now in his medical residency, asked to observe the standard newborn examination. But this wasn't just any medical observation, it was a moment of healing coming full circle. "I want to learn from you," he told Jackie, "both as a nurse and as someone who survived the system's failures. Your experience, your pain, your triumph, they're all part of the medicine I want to practice." The hospital's physical transformation began as well. The sterile white walls of the maternity ward were replaced with murals celebrating diversity. Patient rights were prominently displayed in multiple languages. A new speak-up system allowed patients to record their concerns directly, ensuring no voice went unheard. In the nurse's station, Nancy placed a new photograph next to Tommy's, one of Jackie holding her daughter. A reminder, she explained to her colleagues, of both what we almost lost and what we can become. The resolution wasn't perfect or complete. There were still resistant staff members, still ingrained biases to overcome. But something fundamental had shifted in Memorial's culture. Change doesn't happen in policy meetings, Jackie observed from her recovery room. Watching the sunset paint the snow-covered grounds in shades of gold, it happens in moments of truth, when we choose to face our failures and learn from them. Sarah Chin, who had never stopped documenting, looked up from her tablet. "You know what the most powerful change has been?" she asked. "People are starting to believe they'll be heard." Outside Jackie's room, the hospital continued its daily rhythms, but with subtle differences. Nurses spent more time listening to patients. Doctors double-checked their assumptions. Administrative meetings now included patient advocates. But the resolution was beginning, not in grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but in the small, vital moments of human connection that make up real healthcare. In the end, that might be the most powerful change of all. 1 month after the Memorial incident, the hospital gathered for an unprecedented ceremony in its main auditorium. Jackie, fully recovered and holding her daughter Hope, stood at the podium to inaugurate the new Patient Advocacy and Equity Department. "We name her Hope," Jackie announced, her voice steady and strong, not just because she survived, but because she represents the change we're fighting for. Every patient deserves to be heard, to be believed, to be treated with dignity regardless of their race, culture, or background. The ceremony marked several immediate changes. The Jackie Thompson Protocol became mandatory hospital policy, requiring detailed documentation of all patient concerns and systematic follow-up. Each dismissal of pain or symptoms now required multiple physician reviews and patient consultation. Nancy, instead of being simply dismissed, took on a new role that surprised everyone. She became the head of the hospital's new bias recognition and prevention training program, using her own story as a powerful teaching tool. "I stand before you as both warning and witness," she told each new class of medical staff. "This is what prejudice looks like when it wears scrubs and carries a clipboard. This is how bias can blind us to humanity." Dr. Sullivan's state-level task force implemented immediate changes across all regional hospitals. Memorial became a training center for healthcare equity, with doctors and administrators from other institutions coming to learn from their transformation. Tommy Weber, now completing his residency at Memorial, worked alongside Jackie to develop new protocols for patient advocacy. Their unique perspective, one saved by the system, one nearly destroyed by it, brought a powerful authenticity to the changes being implemented. David's transition from QO to creating the advocacy department sparked a nationwide conversation about leadership in healthcare. Other hospitals began examining their own power structures, questioning whether traditional corporate hierarchies served patient needs. Sarah Chin's documentation became the foundation for a new medical school curriculum on healthcare bias, mandatory for all students and staff. Her tablet's contents, once a record of discrimination, transformed into a roadmap for change. The physical hospital itself underwent transformation. The sterile corridors now featured art from local minority artists. Multi-language signs encouraged patients to speak up about their concerns. Private spaces were created for families to share their experiences with patient advocates. But perhaps the most profound immediate change was visible in the daily interactions between staff and patients. The rushed dismissals and implicit bias that had once characterized too many encounters were replaced by active listening and genuine concern. "What we learned," Jackie explained, holding Hope close, "is that change doesn't have to take generations. Sometimes it just takes the courage to face our failures and the wisdom to learn from them." The immediate resolution wasn't perfect, no transformation ever is, but it was real and tangible. In the hospital's new lobby, a wall of photographs told the story. Jackie and Hope, Nancy and Tommy, Dr. Sullivan and his task force, and countless other faces of change. Above them all, a simple phrase captured the spirit of Memorial's transformation: every patient's voice matters. 1 year after the night that almost claimed 2 lives, Memorial Hospital hosted a different kind of ceremony. In the same lobby where former patients had once gathered to share their stories of discrimination, a new generation of medical professionals took an expanded version of the Hippocratic Oath, one that explicitly addressed bias and prejudice in healthcare. The final impact of the Memorial incident reached far beyond one hospital's walls. Jackie Thompson's position as Chief of Patient Advocacy and Equity became a model adopted by hospitals nationwide. Her story was featured in medical journals, and she became a sought-after speaker on healthcare reform. But it was her daily work, walking the hospital floors and ensuring every patient's voice was heard, that brought the most profound change. Hope turns 1 today, she told the gathered crowd, her daughter now walking with uncertain steps. And in her first year of life, we've seen more positive change than in decades before. But our work isn't finished. The Jackie Thompson Protocol became state law, requiring all healthcare facilities to implement strict anti-bias measures and patient advocacy systems. The legislation, known as the HOPE Act, was being considered for national adoption. Nancy Weber's transformation became a case study in redemption and institutional change. Her bias recognition program was now mandatory for medical licensing renewal across the state. But her most powerful impact came through personal connection. She had counseled hundreds of healthcare workers to recognize and address their own biases. Dr. Sullivan's task force findings led to a complete overhaul of medical education standards. Medical schools now required extensive training in cultural competency and bias recognition, with Memorial serving as a teaching hospital for this new approach. The most unexpected long-term impact came from Sarah Chin. Her detailed documentation methodology became the foundation for a nationwide healthcare bias monitoring system. Hospitals across the country now used her protocols to track and address discriminatory practices. Hope Thompson, the baby who almost didn't survive bias, became a symbol of transformation. Her first birthday celebration, held in the hospital lobby, brought together former patients, staff, and healthcare advocates, all part of the growing movement for medical equity. Tommy Weber, now chief resident, led a new generation of doctors trained to recognize and combat healthcare discrimination. His unique perspective as both a saved child and a medical professional brought authenticity to the ongoing transformation. But perhaps the most profound final impact was invisible to statistics or studies. It lived in the daily interactions between patients and healthcare workers, in the renewed trust between communities and medical institutions, in the simple power of being heard and believed. "We name her Hope," Jackie concluded, watching her daughter play with Tommy's stethoscope, "because she reminds us that change is possible, that even our deepest wounds can heal, that every voice matters." As the ceremony ended, the setting sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows, but they fell differently now, not as barriers between people, but as bridges connecting them. In the end, the final impact of one night's crisis wasn't just institutional change or new protocols. It was the restoration of humanity to healthcare, one patient, one story, one voice at a time. Through Jackie's eyes, watching Hope play in that hospital lobby, I see not just our story, but a movement for change that deserves to be shared. If this tale of transformation touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share it with your loved ones. Your experiences and thoughts matter. Let us know in the comments what this story means to you and what lessons resonated most deeply. As someone who lived through this transformation, I want to say that every subscription helps amplify voices that need to be heard in healthcare. Your support ensures stories like mine continue to drive real change. From all of us at Memorial Hospital and everyone involved in sharing this story, we extend our deepest gratitude for your viewership and support. Together, we're not just watching content, we're building a community committed to healing healthcare.